Of course, Dave, I'm really excited to, get you on the channel. And I believe you can give us a quick history about yourself for people who haven't seen you. It's something to do with stuff in these boxes, right? I've got a few of them behind me as well.
Yeah, back in the days when software came on coasters, my fingerprints were on most of them. I started at Microsoft in MS-DOS, and I worked in MS-DOS for a year doing Smart Drive and double space and disk copy and a bunch of the utilities, set up things that come with MS-DOS. Then I moved briefly to the COM-OLE team, but I jumped really quick to an opportunity to join the NT Shell team at Microsoft, which was to take all of the Win95 user interface from Win95, rewrite, port it for the 32-bit NT operating system. And so we spent a number of years doing that, where we just churn through thousands upon thousands of lines of other people's code, which is actually a really good way to learn a system when you're trying to get your feet wet. That's where we did a lot of the side projects like Task Manager and Visual Zip and Pinball and things like that people may recognize were generally done in that era as well. And so I worked on that all the way through XP and Server 2003. So everything from MS-DOS to Server 2003, kind of that time period.
Dave, I really want to pick your brains about that software. But I'll say this, I started my sort of MCSE journey with NT4, so NT4 is a really special place for me. So thanks so much for, all the hard work that you did in that. So let's talk about like NT4 and Task Manager, because I think there's a really special story there. You've got a lot of cool stories. And actually, just before we start with that, just for everyone watching, please go and make sure that you subscribe to Dave's channel. Dave, tell us about your channel and then tell us about Task Manager.
Sure. Channel Dave's Garage, it focuses really on two bulk topics. One is programming issues, and the other one is Microsoft history, particularly the stuff that I was involved in. So there are a number of topics that have generally proven popular, such as why are blue screens blue, and who decided that they were going to be blue, and that kind of thing. And I have a video on Windows Pinball and the evolution and the history of that and how that got brought over to Windows. And of course, we talk about Task Manager and what are they doing? Zip folders. We have a video on, I believe. And then some more esoteric content like Scroll Lock. Why is it there? What's it for? What's it do? What's it used for today? Why do computers get slower with age and so on?
I mean, I've watched a lot of your videos. I spent most of today watching your videos. Fantastic content. So if anyone who's interested in the sort of the history of Windows and why decisions were made, or just learning programming, highly recommend that you go and subscribe to Dave's channel. One of the big things you're trying to do, Dave, is grow your channel. And I love what you said at the end. You're not trying to sell something. You haven't got Patreons. You're just trying to get subs and likes, right?
Pretty much, yeah. That's what I'm in it for. So
Dave, let's talk about how you started at Microsoft, because there's sort of like a theme, if you like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've kind of seen this theme where you write some software and then perhaps on the side and then it opens doors or something happens. So
yeah, that's been a bit of a history for me, yeah. Initially, I had put myself through college writing a software package for the Amiga called HyperCache, which was to add OS-level cache into the operating system since the Amiga lacked that.
Yeah.
And then for the summer, I was working at the telephone company doing a 10 base T swap over of all their network from, I guess they were on UBNet at something at one point. And so it was kind of a grind job, going through swapping network cards and drivers. And one day I went down to the food court to eat my lunch with the old and the bored, and I grabbed a book from the bookstore called Hard Drive. Hard Drive, it was the history of the making of Microsoft and Bill Gates, I believe. Yep. So I started reading this book, and it was so quantitatively different from the life I was leading, swapping network cards, that the stories of what these people were working on and how fascinating it was, and the fact that billions of people would eventually wind up running it, I knew that's where I wanted to be, but I was in Saskatchewan going to university at the time. So I decided to go through my registration cards for HyperCache, because back in those days, there was no internet yet, or there was no web anyway. And people would fill out these cards with their name and address, and you'd mail them when there was an update to the software. So people mailed these cards in, and a few included their email addresses. So I went through and I looked for absolutely anybody I could find with a Microsoft.com email address, and I just cold emailed them saying, hi, I'm a programmer in Saskatchewan. Here's what I've done, and I'd love to work for Microsoft. And one guy named Alistair Banks got back to me, and he gave me probably the greatest gift you can give to an aspiring graduate, which is the email of a hiring manager with an open position. And that turned out to be Ben Slivka, who did a phone interview with me for MS-DOS, and that's how I wound up in MS-DOS. So it came out and did like the full interview circuit where it's 5 or 6 1-hour interviews with a lunch interview in between. It used to be a pretty grueling process. I don't think they do it quite that way anymore.
Because you wrote the software on the side, and if I remember correctly, you actually had a little business going with that software. Did that kind of open the doors for you?
Well, it got me the job in the sense that it got me the connection initially. And then when I started at Microsoft, I told them I always have had a hobby of writing software on the side.
Yeah.
And we made allowances so that I could continue doing that as long as it wasn't competitive with Microsoft. And so that became handy as well. Basically, I was always working on something at home because I'd see something interesting in the shell at work and I'd want to tinker with it, but you kind of need an opportunity to do that at work, so I would tinker at home. And one of the things that was very frustrating about Windows NT, at least in 3.1, the very first version, was there was no task manager. There was a list of running windows and you could end task on them, but that was really it. So I started thinking around with just, hey, I'll make myself a list of programs and I'll map that to what processes they are. And I'll go through and see if I can figure out how to kill a process as they would do under, not Linux at the time, but perhaps Unix. And it just kind of grew from there as I was building the task manager. Didn't even know what it was going to be called task manager yet, but I was building it at home and adding the features and functionality that seemed obvious and apparent to me that people would need because I wanted it. Yep. So I was by and large writing software for myself. And then I took it in and I was using it at work on my debugging machine, and other developers saw it and said, oh, can I have a copy of that to try it on mine? And it kind of spread around the team until it got to the notice of some of the higher ups like Dave Cutler, and he seemed to enjoy it as well. So he gave me the dispensation to he said, put it on the top of the start menu. Well, that kind of outraged the Windows 95 designers because they had this design aesthetic of simplification and keeping everything out of your face. So sticking it right on top of the start menu was kind of an affront to them. So I think we moved it down to System Tools for the actual NT4 release, and that's where it's lived ever since.
So, I mean, you were writing this, if I remember correctly, because you've got a whole video about this. So just for everyone who's watching, if you want to get more detail, go and have a look at Dave's channel. You wrote this like at home as a hobby, and then that was actually incorporated into Windows and is basically the task manager we have today, right?
Yeah, I got it. The stuff I wrote at home was the real basics, the pages and the layout and stuff like that. And then once I was able to bring it internal, I was able to talk directly to the kernel, because when I was linking at home, I was linking with Visual C, whereas once you're part of the operating system, you have a little greater access to some of the internal functions. So it actually simplified my life quite a bit to become an internal project, I think, in that case.
And I believe, let me see if my notes are right. You've got some like interesting names in the code still, well, perhaps to today, where it's like Dave's frame window or Dave's controls, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, there are some Windows controls that actually don't paint without flicker. So, for example, a group box erases its center and then redraws its contents. And that makes it flicker. So I didn't want that. So I came up with Dave's group box when I was still working.
Very original, right?
Yeah. I just stuck my name in front of the real name and gave it my custom behavior and functionality. But that has stuck, apparently, because it's one of those things. It's never a good time to go in and change. And there was another example where there was a process called kill process. And that was the one that would go through and actually end the process in the kernel. And Jim Allchin wanted to make that recursive. So you could say end process tree, and it would kill your process and everything all the way down. So naturally, the programmer that was working on this work item just went through and replaced process with all children. And so for years in the source code, we had the kill all children function. I was just going to say it's a rather unfortunately named function.
But I mean, that's not visible to me as a user, right? It's all in the source code.
Yeah, perhaps if you had a full internal debug build, it would show up in maybe the symbol table, but I'm pretty sure it makes it doesn't make it past the sanitizing action of the compiler for the public retail builds anyway.
I remember in the old days with Task Manager, I mean, I started with Windows, well, DOS and Windows 3.1 was the first version of Windows that I had in production. You mentioned something, and I kind of, when you said in your video, I remembered this, where you could elevate the privileges of a process, right? And you could kill any process with Task Manager, but they've kind of like limited that these days. Is that right?
A little bit. So initially, we allowed you to kill absolutely anything, including the WinLogon process, which would instantly terminate your session and tear down the machine, because you do technically have the rights to do that if you're an administrator, where if something is running in another user's session entirely, because NT is a multi-session, multi-headed workstation, normally they don't allow you to kill things in other people's session, but Task Manager knows it could if you wanted to, so it just goes ahead and does it for you. So you're limited only by the security and the ACLs and everything you have on your account, and we found that journalists were having a great time killing WinLogon or bug checking the system by killing important pieces of the system and saying, oh, look how unstable the system is. But I mean, you can kill -9 the wrong thing on Linux too and get the same results. So it's one of those don't do that things. And
Yeah, it's interesting because when I watched some of your videos, you also had a piece, and I don't want to get into like the flaming wars, but like Linux versus Windows. And I mean, you said something along the lines that you go immediately into DOS prompt or like PowerShell or something in Windows. It's not like you're just a Windows guy. You know multiple operating systems.
yeah, I do most of my development under Linux on WSL2 on Windows. And then I spend the other half of my day probably because I have the YouTube channel on a Mac in Final Cut and so on. So I actually mix my day almost 1/3, I would say, between the three systems. So each one has, what they're really good at.